What is going on, everybody? My name is Anthony Sabatino, the host of the Anthony Sabatino Show. This is episode 7. We have an amazing guest on. We're going to talk a lot about the crypto space and a lot of things associated. Welcome, David. How are you?
Doing well, Anthony. How about yourself?
I'm doing amazing. Thank you for asking. So I like to always start the show off this way, just so the audience can get some context of basically, who we're talking with, what we're working with here, because especially this space that we're going to talk about today, it's very open-ended. There's a lot of amazing details. So tell everybody, kind of what you do, where you come from, and some of your backstory.
Yeah, so I'm from New York, went to school in LA, and then moved out to Hong Kong, and that's where I started my career. I started at a bank out there, UBS. And then I moved back to New York and was working at a big hedge fund, Millennium. And it was during that time that I was exposed to cryptocurrency for the first time. I just saw an article about it, I think on Bloomberg in 2011, shared it with a bunch of other people and friends I was investing with, and then started to get involved in going to Bitcoin and crypto meetups in New York in 2012, 2013. I eventually left the hedge fund in 2014 and set up my first company in the space called Solid X Partners. And the idea was to be a niche investment bank focused entirely on cryptocurrency. That was early 2014. It was a tough time to start because it was a little bit after the Mt. Gox hack, which was one of the more significant events in kind of the crypto history, which I can go into a little bit more. And then in 2017, I went into this guy, Mike Novogratz's family office. He was an investor out of Fortress and Goldman, and went in to manage all of his digital assets. And then I planted the seeds to launch a hedge fund, a company together that became known as Galaxy Digital. We took that public in Canada in 2018, and it's now a $4 or $5 billion publicly listed asset management firm in the space. And then late 2020, I was exploring moving down to Puerto Rico. And in the process, I reconnected with a couple of guys that I'd known from the hedge fund world and the crypto world, and went out and launched a crypto fund called Coral Capital. It's a crypto hedge fund, and now just launched a venture fund as well. I also advise Brock Pierce and his family or business office, Percival, who's just an old friend and a notable figure in the space. And then I helped another company last year go public in Canada, and it's a company called Immutable Holdings. And it's a parent of NFT.com, which will be launched soon.
Very interesting. Well, definitely a plethora of amazing accomplishments so far. So one thing that I thought was really interesting, just based on your backstory alone, was, being in New York. I'm in New York right now. It's where I grew up. It's where I am now. And the idea of, crypto meetups and things of that nature, especially in the early stages of when crypto really started becoming a name in everyday society, right? I can imagine the meetups back in the day probably weren't too, popular.
Yeah, you nailed it. So, I mean, it was so funny. Like some of the earliest crypto meetups, one of my friends who actually I convinced to move to Puerto Rico last year, Jonathan Mohan, he started the original Bitcoin NYC group, which was, I think in 2012, and the less than 100 people, and they grew to a couple hundred by 2018. By 2013, 14, and then by 2018, 19, it was one of the biggest meetup groups in the world. And initially, it would be 10 to 30 people sitting in a small conference room or wherever we could find office space, really just talking about what Bitcoin is and what the potential was, and all these different things that it could disrupt, and all the things that we're talking about, that we did in the last cycle and in this cycle. These are all things and ideas that we had kind of been dreaming up, 8, 9 years ago now. And then it grew, and we another friend opened up the Bitcoin Center. He took a big space down in Wall Street and had that as a venue where people could go and actually meet up every day, every week, to learn about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, or to buy and sell. And then we also had some other friends who set up something called Satoshi Square, which was meeting up in Union Square and actually just like trading it from our phones and buying and selling from each other. And it was just such a funny period because it looked like people were doing kind of drug deals because they were handing cash back and forth, and then connecting their phones. And then that's why part of the reason why I moved indoors to the Bitcoin Center. But it was really like a pivotal point in time in the industry, because a lot of the people who were involved back then are the ones who've now gone on to be significant entrepreneurs and investors in the space.
To think, the value of being that early, and being able to see that evolvement is probably really amazing. So let's go real basic, right? So a lot of the audience here, they're obviously interested in this space. I have a lot of feedback that I get about just real basic knowledge, because at the macro, right, there's a lot of it that is still to be learned from the general masses of the public, right? So when we look at, what the normal everyday average consumer would want to know about Bitcoin, like what would you kind of say to them?
Yeah, so I think, I spent a lot of time now in my career in the industry, just kind of helping, hundreds of companies get started, and people get jobs in the space and invest in the space, and, from small individual investors to the largest family offices on the planet. And really what I try to do is just understand how people think about money. And so that's something, that I would kind of share with the audience. It's just like, it's really important to understand how we think about money, and what hangups we have, and what our parents did, and what we learned in school, and all where we're from, and all that shapes our relationship with money a lot. And so for me, I felt very fortunate that I started my career in Asia, and what I saw was that the average person in Hong Kong, where I was living, thought about money on a daily basis, because they thought about the Hong Kong dollar, the Chinese yuan, the US dollar, the British pound. In Asia, it's I think one of the most liquid currency pairs in the world is the Japanese yen and the Australian dollar. So there's a lot of individuals that are trading that currency pair and speculating on it. Now, the average American doesn't have a passport, let alone think about currency, right? It's a benefit of being this global reserve currency. There's something, I think the numbers between 150 and 200 million Americans still don't have a passport, meaning they've never left the United States, right? So it's very hard for them to see and understand what it's like to be interacting in different currencies. And that the fact that a lot of other currencies exist in different monetary and economic systems. And when I think about what like money and what currency is, when I see, all right, there's a lot of other competing currencies, whichever countries around the world attract more people to use their currency, to buy it, to do business in it, right? That currency generally has more demand. Now, what's been happening, and Bitcoin was born in kind of in the aftermath of the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And what that kind of was showing was that all right, the idea of a currency born from the internet, right, which had a certain limited mathematical based supply, and it wasn't just controlled by a bunch of individuals of any one government pressing a button and saying, okay, you know what, economy's not doing well, we need to print more money, we need to grow the balance sheet, right? And so it really showed a lot of the flaws that exist within central banks today, and then this idea of a potentially better solution. Now, it's important to understand what Bitcoin is and was from the beginning, right? It's an experiment, right? Now, all of money, all of currency, all civilizations could be thought of and broken down to be thought of as experiments as well, right? Now, everybody early on, like what I was saying about everyone has these different apprehensions that kept people from it, whether they're worried about regulation, they're worried about volatility, about how it's not backed by anything, how governments might shut it down, how it's not tangible, how it's too complicated to understand, right? So all of those I look at as features of Bitcoin, right, and different kind of characteristics. But if you think about it as, all right, well, Bitcoin, it's a little bit like a currency, it's a little bit like a store of value, like gold, right, maybe better, and it's a little bit of an experiment. And so if you think about it in those multiple frames, then you're not going to, put too much emphasis and say, oh, no, there's no way Bitcoin will ever be a currency, right? And so thoughts like that have been what have kind of scared people off from it, or kept people away from getting involved so far.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that I've been widely surrounded by has been this push and pull between, can Bitcoin be used like a dollar, or is it more of like a store of value, like gold, right? Like, can I go to Walmart and buy something? Do you have any, can you speak to that a little bit if there's any validity to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of my last point of all right, if everyone is saying, oh, well, and particularly people in the US or in developed countries, they're like, oh, no, there's no way that Bitcoin will never be a currency, right? And the point is, what they're missing is that we're fortunate, if you're in the US, that everything works. You could take a US dollars, you could take $100 bill, and 350 million Americans will do something for you if you give it, or give you stuff if you give them that $100 bill. In fact, if you go around the world, right, you have the benefit that you don't need to even change it into other currencies. You could go to different countries in Europe and go to South America, and you can hand them a US $100 bill, and a lot of the people there will accept it. So maybe there's 2 or 3 billion people around the world that will accept the US dollar, right? If you go to the 100 euro note, right, maybe it's 1 billion people around the world. If you go to other currencies notes, same thing. It kind of changes who and how will accept it. Now, at the same time, in a lot of other countries, right, that have been facing higher inflation or hyperinflation, Bitcoin has been like a savior to them, right? And there's a situation that came up last year with everything that's happening in Afghanistan, that there have been tens of thousands of people, particularly women, who have been like denied access to bank accounts. And what Bitcoin and cryptocurrency enabled for the first time, it enabled them to earn money online, have their own bank account, right, in the form of their crypto wallets. And then when things were turning very dicey in the country and they needed to flee, right, if they were fortunate enough to, they weren't able to take very much real like assets with them, but they were able to take their cryptocurrency, right? And so that's a really powerful thing that people who are saying, oh no, it'll never be like a currency, miss out on, right? Now in the US, again, to elaborate further, like we have Venmo, we have credit cards, we have all these things that just work and people just trust the banks. They haven't been in a situation where, if you go back just not too many years ago, there was a time in Cyprus and Greece where people went to the bank and they tried to withdraw money and the bank all of a sudden said, no, we're shutting down withdrawals. And then actually, we're only going to be able to give you 70 cents or 30 cents on the dollar of what you thought you had in the bank account.
Do you feel like a lot of that comes down to just an extended period of time of everything being so good, and we kind of almost get brainwashed into understanding how good everything is because we don't have any context from something like a Cyprus situation? So we just almost demonize something that could potentially evolve the idea of currency at large.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, is that, look, in general, when things are good, and like, the US still has been one of the best kind of examples or circumstances of like economic prosperity in human history, right? And so it's like, and the society has done an incredible job of like fostering innovation, entrepreneurship, and opportunity, and not without its flaws, but at the same time, like it's worked, right? And so another just important point to throw in here, like, and I learned this lesson very early on in my career, that optimism pays better than pessimism. Okay, so in the midst of the financial crisis, I myself and 1 or 2 others that were working at the bank at the time were incredibly bearish on the markets, and it turns out we were right. And this was 2007, 2008, and we turned out to be right. But at the same time, when you're bearish and you have a contrarian position and you're right, you're kind of obnoxious, and most people don't want to be around you, right? It doesn't help to be right when everything's falling apart. And the people who ended up doing the best in that period were the ones who, when things were going up, they kept saying, don't worry, everything's fine, keep buying. And when things were falling, they said, don't worry, everything's going up, keep buying. And they managed to buy all along the way. And as long as they didn't over leverage themselves, they kept buying during the dip and the whole time. And the markets are significantly higher than they were back then. And so again, the people who followed and were the most optimistic have done the best. And that same thing is played out in the crypto space. A lot of the people who've been kind of bearish or negative on it or trying to time and trade around the markets are the ones who've actually, like, may have, if they're fortunate, may have made short-term gains and may have like been able to accumulate. But the people who've really done the best in the space are the ones who've just been incredibly optimistic and have actually gotten deep and had a long-term mindset and seen the potential of disruption that's come along. And they've been proven to be right over the last 8, 9 years now.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I'm fascinated by, the psychology, right, of people buying when things are low and buying when things are high, and also, trusting the influence of someone who's giving them that advice, right? And like you see that a lot right now in the social media space in general, right, where people say, oh, like buy this, altcoins and things like that, like things that are just completely, outside of the normal I just want to say like the base foundational that is, kind of Bitcoin, right? And you see all these other things coming in, and you might be able to speak to this more intelligently, but in essence, what I'm noticing, right, is people are becoming, I don't want to use the word gullible, but they're becoming very influenced by brand, basically, right, of people who are pushing things, and that's something very, something to be very cognizant about as we continue into this digital landscape. Would you agree?
Yeah, completely. And so that's where really, like, one of the things I try to do is just protect people help people learn, help people take a kind of, open-minded approach to the space, but not just like green-eyed and chasing the latest meme coins and all of that. And so, I get asked every single day by, dozens of people of what crypto they should be buying. And, I try to steer them away from even asking that and steer them towards like understanding how, there's so much opportunity. And, what it takes is actually either coming from what they already know and figuring out how that's going to be disrupted by certain innovation in the crypto space and blockchain technology, or right, to get deep and follow their excitement. So to go back to when I first started going to crypto meetups in New York and San Francisco and Miami and LA, like what I was doing was I was seeking out the things that people were geeking out over and excited about. And so that's kind of even now, like when people ask me my investment strategy or some of the important things I look out for, like I try to find things that people are really, really excited about that they'll do and build and focus on and be committed to, whether the prices are going up or down, like regardless of where crypto prices are. And so those are the people that are just they're passionate and they're excited to build the things that they feel are important, right? And so and fortunately that's worked out very well doing that. And I think when I try to tell people to get in the space, instead of just because they hear, oh, some friend of theirs made a fortune in a meme stock or meme coin or meme stock too. We're seeing the same thing happen in the traditional equity markets. And the term I came up with is we're seeing what I call the Robin Hoodization of the financial markets. And so what's happening is more and more the percentage of people that know nothing about financial metrics and the actual prospects of companies, but are buying into stocks and into cryptocurrencies just because they like the name of it, or they hear their friends are buying it, or they see a group like Wall Street Bets or Reddit is getting behind it, or it's low priced, right? It's driving a lot of kind of faster money than has ever existed in the financial markets and crypto markets. And for periods of time, that works. An often like overlooked aspect of all kinds of markets is capital flows. When money is flowing into something, right, prices go up. When money is flowing out, prices go down. Right? It's very simple. And so when a bunch of other people get excited about a meme they hear and they start buying it, the prices go up. And so it's important really to not get caught up by that. Right now in every cycle, there's kind of different tools that are available. In the last cycle, it was much more Slack. Now it's on Telegram groups and Discord channels. And so today, right, if a friend of ours came to us and they asked us how to get involved in the space, I tell them they can, within 10 minutes, get into a Discord and be chatting with the founders of any project they want to in the space. And they can get deep and they can contribute ideas. And so it really is what I consider like one of the most meritocratic kind of games or systems the world's ever seen.
Yeah, and it's so I love how you put that, right? Because I'm a lot of the consulting that I do is on branding, right? And how best can we leverage and build a brand? And there's something that it's never been more prevalent, right? In these Discord and Telegram channels, right? People are building brand grouped in community like never before, at least from what I'm noticing, right? And I was wondering if you could speak to, maybe why that's so important. Like, why do you feel at its core that the community is what the driving force is, outside of maybe just the cash flow, or do you think maybe that is the singular thing?
No, look, at the end of the day, like community matters. To the point I made about countries competing, right, by attracting people to use their currency, that same thing is playing out now within the crypto communities, right? Of all the major layer one protocols and all the smaller kind of different systems and that have been set up and platforms, right? Everyone is competing to attract usage and adoption and community, right? And so, and there are some aspects that are like almost like religions, right? When people just believe in something, whether it's believing in the importance of it, believing in the superiority of the technology, all of those things are necessary, right? To really build up a vibrant, robust community that's going to last through like market cycles.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And do you feel like that's just going to keep doubling down at this point?
Yeah, I think what's fascinating now is so there was this guy Metakoven who made headlines for making the largest NFT purchase. He bought the Beeple Everydays for $69 million last year, and I heard a podcast he was on. He made a comment about crypto being the new America, and what he meant by that was that. And he's an Indian guy, right? And what he meant was that if you go back to the last couple hundred years, what America was and the idea was that people from all over the world wanted to come here, right, to benefit because it was a land of opportunity and freedom, and to escape religious and all other kinds of like persecution, right? What crypto has enabled is that anybody who wants, anybody can sitting anywhere in the world, as long as they have an internet connection, right, can participate in this new ecosystem. And as much as they put in, as many novel ideas, if they right now there's no advantage or barrier from one person starting a project in any country around the world over another, right? Other than some local taxes and regulations and other things.
Yeah, fascinating. And I'm really interested to see how it grows, right? And how much community continues to play a part in things, because you see once you have a really valid community where people are really attached to whatever that brand and that ambition that project, let's say in this case, right, is after, you start seeing things like really interesting collaborations, right? You start seeing where communities merge and build something even bigger. I'm really interested to see kind of where that entire world almost, builds off on its own. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting innovation just in that world itself.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. So let's talk. So we touched on a little like for a quick second about, the NFT situation, and obviously it's, it's sitting on the bedrock, right, of crypto. Where would you say, and again, we touched on that too with community, right? Because so much of an NFT project is built on in a Discord channel or a Telegram channel where your community is basically, building into the hype of what your project represents. There's, obviously you hope there's utility along with it. There's so much to that. Where do you kind of see the usage of Ethereum particularly as do you kind of see it as a long-term play in the NFT world?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the same way that Bitcoin, if I think about all, like one of the ways I'd explain just the universe and landscape of crypto assets, right? There's, Bitcoin, and then all these other things that try to compete with Bitcoin on, scalability and speed. Then there's Ethereum and being a much more robust programming language and much more comprehensive with smart contracts and everything, and all these other things that are trying to compete with Ethereum. And then a lot of other, stable coin-like assets and security token assets, which have to do a lot like, normal equities. And so, when I think about even with all the innovation and experimentation around different things around Bitcoin, Bitcoin has still held its position because it still is, the most gold-like and the most important, the longest record, a lot of other key aspects. And most people within the space just want to have more and more Bitcoin, right? And so with Ethereum, the same kind of thing, that even though it's gotten expensive to use and other things, that if I gave people a choice and said, all right, between Ethereum and Solana and Polkadot and Avalanche and Polygon and all these other new platforms, if you had a very valuable NFT and you could only store it on one chain, where would you want to store it? And everybody would still choose Ethereum. And so based on its positioning and track record and where it is so far, it still is most likely that it's in the kind of leading position that it's in today. That being said, there's really important innovation that's happened in a lot of these other layer one protocols. And I think we're going to see more and more kind of usage and adoption and new innovative projects being built on those. And so there is some path forward where, we could see either a much more like equal playing field between a couple of the bigger layer ones, or, where we eventually see something surpass either.
That makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong here. To my knowledge, the biggest issue that a lot of people are voicing, at least with using Ethereum through an NFT space, is the idea of the scalability of the transactions. Right? Am I off on that or no?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's also it's very expensive too. So that's an aspect of it, just because of so there's the scalability and the cost. And then there's also this upgrade that they're going through from proof of work to proof of stake. And, there's a lot of friction along the way and kind of mixed views on whether that'll succeed. There's a couple of other Ethereum competitors out there that are building proof of stake systems from day one that are trying to say they're building, to a kind of where Ethereum's trying to get to, or a better version of what Ethereum's even trying to get to. So with a lot of this, it goes back to like, the storyline matters and the technology matters, but it's a little bit of each of this, right? When you think that it's all experimentation. So
yeah, it really is. And so if we're looking at NFTs as a whole, right, one of the most prevalent things that people say, and it's very often said now, but I really think having conversations as much as possible about this to see if there's still even more depths and more validity to it. So, if you look at anything that has, just so much demand, right? Like there's so much greed, there's so much demand, crazy amount of involvement from new players, right, in the NFT space, really crypto at large, I would assume. And so really anytime that's the case, right, yet there's not as much supply to basically back up the amount of demand. Usually what happens is some course correction, right? Like something usually shifts in some way, shape, or form. Do you feel like this is going to be another one of those situations where the NFT market, which is so hot right now, could potentially in 6 months, a year, whatever the timeline ends up being, come to some sort of a course correction?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that. I mean, we've seen it happen a couple of times. One of the interesting things that's happening just overall in the crypto markets and the NFT market as part of it is that kind of the cycles are speeding up in a way. We're seeing very fast corrections. We're seeing very fast rebounds. And it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out from here. But yeah, I mean, I have this view that, and I think a number of others share it, that somewhere between 95 and 99% of all NFTs that are being bought today are ultimately worthless. Now, some small percentage of them, based on the time frame and storyline and this cultural significance, or their ability to grow in utility over time and bring community together, are going to increase in value significantly. Right now, that's not all that different than the way I think of the traditional art world. Right. So again, 90 to 99% of all art that's bought and sold is worthless. Right. The way most art works is, we go to a kind of art gallery and you buy some art, and you think because you paid a certain amount for it, it sits on your wall, you think it's worth that much. But the point is, after a certain period of time, if you were to try to resell it, maybe if the artist was still relevant, or something, you might get lucky and get 30, 50, 70% of what you paid for it. Right now, if you aren't able to sell it, you give it to your sibling, or you give it to someone else when you move. And again, you think in your mind, you tell them what it's worth, but they're never going to sell it. And then eventually they put it in their garage, or they put it in storage, and it sits there, it gets passed to the next generation, or gets thrown out. Right. So again, the majority of all art is fundamentally worthless. Now, at the same time, it's appreciated, it's enjoyed, it's all of that. Right. It supports the artist, it supports just general, creative movements and all of that. What's happening in the NFT space, at least in terms of digital art, is the same thing. Right now, a lot of it is nonsense, and unfortunately, the same thing with a lot of meme coins and meme stocks. A lot of people are going to get hurt from it, but at the same time, there are going to be certain things that are significant that come out of this period. We just saw that with Artifact, which was acquired, and so the clones that they had been selling all of a sudden started to accrue a lot of significant value, because that could end up being one of the more important projects in the space. Right, CryptoPunks and Bored Ape Yacht Club. Some people saw it coming, and Bored Ape Yacht Club, I think, has now surpassed CryptoPunks in terms of total market cap. So yeah, and so looking ahead, I mean, I think there's still going to be interesting new kind of NFT projects that are launched, but the vast majority are going to be kind of worthless and insignificant over time.
Yeah, for sure. And so I own one NFT, and one of the things that I looked at was, can I guess at the end of the day, it's another version, right, of experimenting at a certain level, right? And so my main thing was I almost put the art design itself, on the back burner. I said, is there genuine utility? Like, is there something that could potentially grow into something that could be of use, be of value in some fashion, right? And I feel like that's where a lot of people, and you're noticing that, right, where you say 95 to 90, 99% are ultimately worthless because they have basically zero utility. And to that point, it's interesting as we keep going, because to your point too, I really view the same trend happening, where you're seeing the involvement increase drastically and drastically faster, right? And if you look at, I almost throw that through the lens of branding as well, and through social media, just because that's the world I'm living in right now with my business. You look at the past 10 years, and it's taken 10 plus years for social media to be around for us to get here. But if you look even the past 2 years, it's been a crazy jump, right? And I think 3 years from now, we're going to be in an even crazier jump. So it's going to keep getting faster and faster. And my point I always make to people that I talk to, and even through my content, is if you can't get your leg up on what Instagram and TikTok is doing now, in 3 years, when we're in a completely different landscape, you're going to be in a completely confusing state, and there's going to be no help at that point, right? And I think that's probably what's going to happen in the course correction with NFTs.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important point you brought up. Like, if you think about all these social media platforms, right? Like, yeah, every 1, 2, 3 years, there's a new platform that's important that comes about, and it's much harder, right, today to go on to Instagram and get to 1 million followers than it is to get to TikTok, or to get that on TikTok or some newer platform, you know. And so it's as you catch the waves of these new platforms emerging. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that Instagram and Facebook and Twitter have lost their value, right? They still have their niche, right? And that's the same way you could think about the way that these crypto platforms are going to evolve and exist, that each of them may have different groups of people on there. Some people will be traversing and be involved with multiple of them, and some people will be all in and focused on the individual platform.
Yep. Couldn't have said better. I like that standpoint a lot. And so interestingly enough, right, we talk about this, right? And just as a quick pivot, the idea of the blockchain, I think, is important to touch on too, right? I think because that being the bedrock of all of this, right? The idea to understand what that looks like at macro is really important, especially as we continue to evolve. And one of the things I watched an interview that you had done, I forget the exact place you're at, but basically the interviewer had asked you the question about the idea of, there's going to be multiple blockchains, and the example of metaphor, and I'll let you speak to this, but just in general was the idea, like, there's multiple different messaging platforms that people use, like Messenger or WhatsApp, whatever, across regions, and like the blockchain might emulate that. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even now there's multiple different metaphors we could take it, right? Whether we're talking about new social media platforms that are launching, or how different countries have, there's a couple hundred currencies that exist in the world, right? And there's different messaging platforms, and there's no, despite all these attempts to get people to, cross, to interact across different platforms, the individual ones still exist, right? So, there's iMessage, there's WhatsApp, there's Kakao, WeChat, there's ones that are more popular in certain countries. There's ones that are more popular based on certain types of operating systems, right? And I guess that's a good way to think about it, in that, like, there's all these different niches that are going to exist. There'll be bridges between them, so that, somebody who's using an iPhone, when they send an iMessage, or what, the same way that they're texting everybody else, they can send a text to somebody who's using Android, right? Now, it doesn't exist yet, so there they have a cross-chain interoperability. When, if you're using WeChat, right, you can't send a message to somebody on iMessage. You can't send a message to somebody online in Japan. And so, there's certain systems that are a little bit more closed off. Now, it doesn't mean that those systems don't have incredible value. They might have other features. In fact, when you look at WeChat is potentially, and Kakao and Korea, those are potentially, they have the most functionality of any messaging system, right? So they have increased functionality, but less interoperability. So it starts to, like, kind of have a very similar, interesting overlap to the way a lot of crypto platforms work today.
And so that's where you kind of feel the blockchain is going to end up becoming, where there's going to be multiple different ones, just a matter of figuring out which has more function for what your purpose is.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly that. But some of them, like even right now, we're seeing, from a lot of the major crypto platforms, certain ones have had more significant presence in different countries, right? And so, Polygon and Matic is, has a huge presence in India, for example. And so that's the base, and then they're building out from there. Now there's expanded and have a lot of presence in the Middle East as well. And so this now, with the interesting thing here that's at play, and one of the most fascinating things to watch, is that the same way that, I described crypto as being the most meritocratic game the world's ever seen for people to get involved with it, it's also one of the most, like, interesting and fascinating for countries and companies to compete. So that, more than ever before in history, any one country, by opening their doors and by embracing innovation, or, putting more lax tax laws or regulation, can attract individuals and companies and platforms to migrate a lot of their usage to that country, right? So, I could see it over the next couple of years, they're definitely being significant, and politicians realizing this and really, really fighting to attract a lot more of the crypto platforms to participate in their countries.
That makes a ton of sense. And so based on the company's perspective, right, do you kind of see this also as a player in things like fundraising? Because I know that I know a little bit about, the idea of using crypto as a foundation for fundraising. Have you seen anything in your doings, or kind of see that as another ever growing, basically, field?
I mean, completely. So in the last cycle, it was through, what were called ICOs. Now, even the NFT launches are essentially, just a novel way to fundraise, and then people are Some of them are just running away with the money, and some of them are trying to build out businesses and communities around it, right?
Yeah.
You know, what's fascinating too is that, like, this is a good example that, look, the US, because of some of the onerous regulations here, a lot of the newer projects restrict investors from the US and North Korea, right? You know, with a couple other jurisdictions along the way. But the point is, Americans are actually at a disadvantage now to participate in a lot of the new innovation that's coming.
Really interesting. And so I love your point too when you say like an NFT project is basically just a fundraising, right? And I know a ton of examples of different projects that I follow where, you know, to your point, they're basically, you know, they're selling out the project, you know, right at launch. They got this big lump sum of money. And like you said, a lot of people can just run away with the money, or some, especially the ones that I'm following, a lot of times what they're doing is they're taking that liquid money that not necessarily liquid, but they have it now to use. And now they're building out, you know, another business, or even more interestingly, they're just building out more growth to further expand the value of the project itself for then resale value, which is really interesting because then you look at your holders of the project and you're trying to build it out for them, which obviously in essence build it out for you too. And you get this big essence of community again, which is so just to keep reassuring, you know, term that keeps coming back in this space. And I love that outlook. You know what I mean? Like to keep doing that.
One important point, I kind of am teaching a handful of friends that have gotten excited about the NFT space, just that it's something important to learn about markets, right? That people will look at, they'll buy into an NFT project and they'll buy it at, let's just simplify and say it's at 0.1 Ether for a couple $100, then they'll see the floor of the project is 1 Ether, right? And so they'll think if they bought, you know, 10 of them, then all of a sudden that they turned 1 Ether into 10 Ether because the floor price, the lowest one being offered for sale is that 1 Ether price, okay? Now, what I explain to people is just because nobody else is listing it there, it doesn't mean that there's actual demand to buy all of the NFTs of that kind at that price, right? That if everybody were to try to sell, it might be worth 0.1, the original price, or even less, because it doesn't work. If no one is selling and you have more and more people coming in and interested to buy into the project, right, then it's worth the floor, worth more than the floor. But if nobody is selling because everyone just thinks they have this theoretical value, right, then it's not real and it's all phantom, you know, gains. And so, you know, it's where I try to tell people is like, even when they see that, if they think that they've, you know, I really try to encourage like that when the prices are rising is the time where they want to be selling into it. And so selling into kind of the demand and the hype and not get too caught up with how much they think they've made on it.
So interesting. That's a good lesson to learn. I bet you a lot of people fall into that trap, right? Because it's at essence, you're just looking at a facade of numbers and you want to almost rationalize what you want to believe. You know, so even if the math itself doesn't work out, you still want to believe that. And that's because none of it's really tangible and it's all looking at a screen, you can very easily fall into that, I'm assuming.
Right.
Cool. Well, listen, so if I just want to end it off with this, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that maybe you've talked to somebody, you had a conversation with, that you think is important for people who are listening? And this could be at large, you could take this any direction you want, but I just wanted to provide as much value to everybody listening in any direction. So anything that you would say that you'd want to kind of end this off with?
Oh, perfect. So I think, you know, the biggest topic and what could actually be the most important thing of this year that we haven't touched on yet is DAOs. So decentralized autonomous organizations. And a close friend of mine, another guy who I convinced to move down to Puerto Rico, his name is David Johnston. He wrote the original white paper on dApps, decentralized applications. And he had this concept that he put out a term called Johnston's Law, which is everything that can be decentralized will be decentralized. I put my own iteration on it, and in Japan, I called it Namudaro's Law, which is anything that should be decentralized will be decentralized.
Okay.
So now with DAOs, you know, as we start to think about, like, it's kind of the early forms of experimentation that we saw with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a lot of the other earliest projects. We're seeing experimentation on what it's like to have shared group or community ownership over a platform or a project or a fund or a lot of different things. And so, you know, I think really, like, it's what I'm encouraging people to kind of dive into most and learn about, because right now it's still very hard to understand, hard to see the benefit of it. But what's going to end up happening is it's really going to drive like much more engaged ownership over different things. And for people who, you know, get involved with a community or project early to accrue the value that they kind of create from being on that platform. So really, when I think about, going back to these like social media networks and Twitters and Facebooks and, Instagram and TikTok, in that the people who get involved early and help create the value there, right, aren't really benefiting from it. So, hopefully in the future, if there's a lot of DAO-like mechanisms, we'll see the earliest participants and users actually benefit along the way.
So interesting. Yeah. Something I really want to look into personally more is DAOs. I think there's a lot of validity there. And I think it's almost like the next, I don't want to use the term frontier because it's not, but it's that next big thing that people are going to, once they grasp the foundational concepts, they're going to start realizing there's a lot more involved. So that'll be interesting. All right. Well, listen, David, amazing conversation. I think there's so many people have probably learned so many things. I personally learned a lot just from the way you articulated it. So I genuinely appreciate that. And I'd love to obviously stay connected. Before we let you go, any particular, channels or any way that people can get in contact with you that you want to plug in, that'd be great.
I think my Instagram, David J. Namdar, my Twitter's @Namdar, and then people feel free to add me on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. And we'll put all that on an end screen and we'll put it in the description on YouTube as well. But everybody listening, hopefully you got that. Listen, David, I genuinely appreciate you for taking the time and being on the show today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome. It's been great chatting.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Took a shot in the dark to make my own lane. I think that I'm better go my own way, so I didn't. Now I'm on my own, yeah, I'm on my way. Keep my head up till I find my place, yeah, I'm on my